Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Communicating in Tough Times. My name is John Wright, and I am the President and Managing Director here at the Canadian Management Centre. I'll be your host for today's webinar, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session. This topic has had an enormous amount of interest, and you'll see why in a few moments. We've had over 1,200 people register to attend today's webinar, and we're very excited to bring this content to you today. The flow of what you'll be hearing over the next 55 minutes or so, first I'm going to give you a little bit of info on how we are going to use the Twitter platform today. Then I will give you a bit of background on who CMC is. From there, I want to take a look at the poll results, and if you haven't had a chance to vote on the poll results, please take a moment to do so. The information from those results helps myself and Jim Gray, who's today's feature speaker, address our results specifically to the situation that you're encountering in your workplace. And after that, I'm going to set the stage for today's topic, and then I will do a more formal introduction today of Jim Gray. For today's session, we're asking you to please submit questions to us using Twitter. Twitter is something that many people are using today. We certainly use it here at the Canadian Management Centre, and the hashtag is #CMC events. So please take a moment at any time, tweet the question to us, and we will respond to it later in our discussion. The other thing is, if you just want to join in on today's discussion using Twitter, you're more than welcome. Again, please use the same hashtag #CMC events. Add any comments or thoughts there and just join the discussion that's happening right across North America as we go through this topic today. If you're new to the Canadian Management Centre, I just want to give you one slide with a bit of background on who the Canadian Management Centre actually is. We are based in Toronto, although we are a national company. We're a learning and training company that is what I call multidisciplined with multimodalities. By that, I simply mean we offer training and development education that covers project management right through to communications training, and especially around leadership training within all levels of an organization. Some of you may not know that the Canadian Management Centre is actually part of a global network. We're part of the American Management Association network that operates in 18 countries, and one of the clear benefits to that is access to global content, global best practices, and global delivery should any organizations need it. The last thing, and something that's surprising for people to learn, is that the Canadian Management Centre is actually a not-for-profit organization, but we are one with a mission. And our mission is to build inspired partnerships that prepare the next generation of leaders to thrive in tomorrow's marketplace. And certainly today's topic about communicating in tough times certainly plays right into that mission. Now let's go on to the poll results. Question number one was, who is the prime target group for your tough conversations? And it looks like clients are just slightly edging out colleagues. Okay, so Jim and I can take that into account today as we address our comments. And then the second question is, how many people in total do you actively, directly or indirectly manage? We've got some fairly big numbers there in terms of the people that responded, very large groups, 11 to 20 plus. Okay, so we're talking larger internal audiences. All right. Great, thank you very much for your feedback. On the screen, you'll see basically a collage of headlines from really the last 6 months. It's still what I would call a bit of economic turbulence out there, and certainly these headlines bear it out. What I found really surprising, though, was two pieces of information that kind of capture the mood of Canadians coast to coast. This first one I took from the Globe and Mail. Canada is not technically in a recession, but to the vast majority of consumers, it feels like one. And as we've traveled across Canada doing training sessions for large organizations, certainly those organizations are still somewhat, I would say, unsettled. I don't think those organizations feel they are clear of the recession, but they now have to just basically start to move forward and start to figure out how to grow their businesses in this current economic turbulence. The second thing that really struck me, and this gets to the heart of the individual, and that's a consumer confidence consumer confidence showed that Canadian economy and people's belief in improving their own economic situation. Only 32% of Canadians actually believe that the Canadian economy and their own economic situation will improve this year. And what surprised me the most was that was down 11 points from 43% last year. So when you take those two things together, people are still very unsettled. Confidence is still, I would say, at a bit of a low ebb. I would say optimism not so high, and consequently, our topic today about communicating in challenging times is wholly appropriate. Whenever we do these kinds of webinars or live events, I always like to bring in some research that helps frame up why this topic really matters beyond the obvious, beyond the headlines we just discussed. So I want to share with you a bit of research that I found very helpful in framing this up. First, the two top factors contributing to an increase in employee engagement are first, the quality of individual supervisor relationships at 85%, but just behind it, the amount of employee communication at 81%. So obviously everybody can agree that having an engaged workforce is a strong positive for any organization, and this research clearly shows that employee communication is a key driver of engagement. Second, this research was interesting. 80% of employees with a high degree of trust in management are they themselves committed to the organization. So what that really means is if you want high retention rates among your staff, and if you want to retain your better performing people, you can do so when you engender a high degree of trust. And where does that come from? Well, that comes from authentic, honest, frequent communications. Next, came across this information, which again I thought was really interesting. Companies that are highly effective at both communications and at change management are 2.5 times as likely to outperform their competitors. And what that says to me is that making sure that you have good communications, even great communications inside your company, is paramount to outperforming your competitors in the marketplace. And last, sometimes people will say, is communication and my ability to communicate something I should be able to do naturally? Well, for those that can, it's a gift, no question. But what this research also pointed out is that 65% of companies with highly effective communication that impacts their business results, those companies actually train their managers to communicate effectively with employees. So all to say that communication, very, very important. It's important to retention of your employees. It's important to the trust levels that you build inside your organizations. It's highly important to outperforming your competitors, and it's also something that you can train within your workforce. So with that brief introduction and background, I want to take a moment and introduce our key speaker today, Mr. Jim Gray. Jim is a leading North American media strategist and communication skills coach. He's a former journalist with the Toronto Star and with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. He's also a published author and has published a book, How Leaders Speak. For the last 15 years, Jim has specialized in focusing on people and coaching people on practical media and presentation skills, and he's done that with senior executives, physicians, and public figures, both in Canada and throughout the United States. And I'm very proud to say that Jim's been one of our faculty members delivering communications training here at Canadian Management Centre for over 5 years. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Jim Gray.
John, thank you, and welcome everyone, and happy Valentine's Day. This is a fascinating subject, communicating in tough times, and certainly one that's applicable in our world today. We've identified 10 top tips for communicating effectively in tough times. Let's get right into them. Tip number 1, has to do with taking on the issue, whether it's internal or external. As John described, I work with leaders right across North America. I do a fair bit of crisis communications, and I've been fascinated by the coverage of the Costa Concordia incident. Of course, the cruise ship went off aground near Italy, off the coast of Italy, on January 13th. And I was interested to see that the chairman and chief executive officer of Carnival Cruise Lines, which owns the Concordia, didn't make a public appearance for 2 weeks afterwards. So Mickey Arison didn't show up in public until January 27th at a Miami Heat basketball game. He happens to own the Heat. So for 2 weeks, he was AWOL. The media slagged him and Carnival, and he was dubbed the Invisible CEO. Now, I'm sure Mr. Arison had his reasons for not showing up in public or making a public statement other than expressing condolences for the victims. But leadership is more about just what you say. It's how you say it and where you say it. I found that fascinating. Increasingly, we see that organizations today are being judged not only on the incident, but how it handled or how they handled the incident. Media are fascinated by crisis communications and how organizations deal with crisis situations. John?
You know, one of the things I've been fortunate to do over my career is to be a person who's had the good fortune of leading a number of different organizations. And sometimes you have to take on an issue that's difficult. And one of the issues that a lot of companies have to take on in these challenging times is the issue of an earnings announcement that may be followed with some kind of layoff or action plan to try and signal to the market what they're doing to bring things back in line. And the key lessons that come out of that are applicable up and down the organization. And those are, the first thing is that process is key. You have to have a very well understood and well articulated process for communicating bad news. It's not something that you can take upon yourself as one person. You need to involve a team and actually write down and map out exactly how the process of that announcement is going to go. The second thing is you have to communicate honestly to all stakeholders. So when you're thinking about your messages, you have to think, who would all the stakeholders be that may be affected by this news, and make sure that you have messages that are appropriate to all of them. And again, in something like an earnings announcement, you may be focused on talking to a marketplace, but let's not forget, you're not just talking to the marketplace, you're talking to your employees, the vendors that work with your company. And even out to the marketplace, you're signaling to potential employees who are considering joining your company potentially at some point in the future. And the last thing is just simply message consistency. When you craft your messages for something difficult like this, keep them short, and Jim's going to talk about that in a little while, but make sure that you use only those messages consistently across your organization. You'll hear us talk about a phrase today, which is stay on message.
I'm a big believer in the power of the story. So the longer I spend in this business, the more impressed I am by the power of the story. You need a tight, integrated story, especially in bad times. And one of the most important parts of your story has to do with context. And context is background or perspective from your point of view. It helps set up your argument, your points to come. And someone who I think uses context extraordinarily well is President Obama. I was fascinated by how he used context in a healthcare debate in the U.S. in 2009 and 2010. I'd just like to read to you a brief paragraph. This is his opening lines from his healthcare address to the joint session of Congress in the U.S. in November of 2009. And basically, the president said, "Madam Speaker, Vice President Biden, members of Congress, and the American people. When I spoke here last winter, this nation was facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. We were losing on average 700,000 jobs per month. Credit was frozen, and our financial system was on the verge of collapse. How's that for powerful context for setting up the points to come? And especially in difficult times, in tough times, often leaders don't provide that context and almost have an expectation that their audience is going to be up to speed on the issue or points that they'll be making, and often the audience isn't. John?
Thanks, Jim. You know, one of the things that, again, happens many times with organizations and really brings home this idea of setting context, you may be facing some great news about a big business win that's come your way, and other times you may have to communicate a client loss and what impacts that may have. When you really think about this idea of providing context, you know, big wins initially have that euphoria and everybody is really, really excited. But what they're missing is, well, why did, you know, they may not know, why did we go after that client in the first place? But for sure, they're starting to think about, how will this impact me? I'm feeling stretched already in just delivering the client base we have. Now you're adding to that. I'm excited, but I have to think I'm a little bit nervous. So you need to be thinking about that even in such great situations like big wins. When it comes to big losses, obviously losing a client, and I've seen it happen where companies have, in fact, folded. They've been a service company. They've had a dependency on a key client, 60 to 80% of revenue, and when that client leaves, they've actually had to shut the doors. Sometimes, though, it may not be that big a loss. Maybe it's 20% of revenue, but it still has a ripple effect. The leader needs to be honest in describing the potential impact on the organization, being very clear about the impacts on its employees, both in the short term and the long term. This could mean just signaling that there will be a restructuring coming, that I have to be honest with you, there will be some job losses. Some of you may be assigned from your current responsibilities. Sometimes you ask your staff to just please be flexible so that you can look to see how to move them into other parts of the organization, or at least announce some cost-cutting measures that may need to be done as a result of a client loss. So again, in getting to those messages, you have to get through a really solid context-setting discussion first so that those follow-on messages make sense.
Anticipate. Every effective leader needs to know his or her story. And the preparation for the story starts with anticipating the questions that will be asked after the story is communicated. Now, again, I work with organizations all over North America, and it's interesting to see the different way they tackle this. In the pharmaceutical industry, if a company has a new product or service, it will come up with 150 potential questions that could be asked about that new product or service. But a standard way to go is to anticipate the 20 most likely questions to be asked about the issue. If you can nail the responses to those 20 questions, you're in pretty good shape with the telling of your story.
One of the other things, too, is this whole idea of using all the communication vehicles that are at your disposal, including social media, increasingly these days, to help tell your story. I've often said to colleagues and to clients that, you know, the older days when you could do internal memos to your staff and PR releases to the market, those days are long gone. Mm-hmm. You need to be thinking about not just the vehicles that you have, but the vehicles where you think people may go looking for information when you're making any kind of announcement, especially external ones. You have to think about things like, what are the key search terms that I need to plan for if people might look for information about my announcement using Google? You have to make sure that this information about your organization can't be buried in your website somewhere. It's got to be up front, and people have to be able to navigate to it very, very quickly. Obviously, if you have email addresses for people that are your customers or vendors you may be dealing with, and you want to get a targeted message to them so that you are, in fact, controlling the message and making sure that they get the facts right from you, then use your email systems. And no question these days, using Twitter, and if you have a Facebook fan page for your organization, you're going to want to direct people using those two platforms to your key information so that, again, they get the right information on a timely basis. But also, the other critical thing is you have to use those platforms like Twitter and Facebook as a monitoring device. listening for people's reaction to what you've put out to the marketplace, and listening for feedback on how they feel about it. One example of an organization where not anticipating things didn't work out so well is very, very recent, and that's McDonald's. In this particular case, McDonald's had this idea that they would want to create this sort of wholesome, feel-good experience and allow people to talk about all the great experiences they've had themselves or with their families eating at McDonald's. And so they thought they would use Twitter as their platform. They created a hashtag for it, hashtag McD Stories, and they encourage people to post stories about the great experiences that they've had. Well, in a classic example of not anticipating what could happen, this campaign turned very dark very quickly. Within 2 hours, there were very negative postings already online. You can see a few of them on the screen talking about not so tasty things turning up in people's foods, and basically, some sarcasm and humor. The reaction from McDonald's was that within 2 hours, they actually had to pull this whole campaign because they were shocked at how negative some of the commentary was. One of their social media directors said, as Twitter continues to evolve its platform and engagement opportunities, we're learning from our experiences. And while, honestly, I respect that, this guy's the director of social media. He should have anticipated it rather than using that commentary as an oops after the fact. It's pretty embarrassing for an organization the size of McDonald's.
When communicating good news, bad news, any news, the key principle to keep in mind is make it about them. Make it about your listeners. I think that last October, when RIM had its infamous outage right across the world, it lost sight of that principle, and in fact was very late to the game, in my opinion, in updating its users about what was happening and why. But I'd like to give you an example, an internal example of a woman who I met actually at a course here at Canadian Management Center a few months ago who really gets this, making it about them. She works in HR for a very highly thought of company in Toronto. And of course, she's inundated with job applications, and she interviews many people who are applying for jobs within her organization. If she has the opportunity to meet with a person and the person is not successful in getting the job, she will make sure she has a personal conversation with that person to tell them the news and tell them as far as she can why they didn't get the job, whether it's over the phone or in person. Now think about all the times job applicants are blown off by email or not even email in this day and age, and think about how this woman conducts herself and how she enhances the reputation of the firm she's employed by.
Jim talked about great experiences that you have at training courses, and several years ago, I had actually gone to a training course myself, and one of the great pieces of advice that I took from that, and I share it freely with people when we talk about communications, is this very simple but powerful thought of you need to speak into your target audience's listening. And the expression was, you think about it like a radio broadcast. You're broadcasting a message on a certain frequency, but have you tuned in to how the other person is listening? And one of the critical things that will give it away is whose language are you using when you're communicating? If you're a more senior person in the organization, you may be using more senior type terms and phrases that you're used to with your colleagues at your peer level. That may not really work or really connect with people lower down in the organization and their day-to-day reality. So one of the ways you can speak into your target audience's listening is to make sure you're very careful about picking language and terms and expressions that they're familiar with and not just make it all about you. And the second thing is bridging the gap between the key message that you want to say and making sure that you're saying it in a way that your audience is listening for what it means to them. A lot of times announcements are made and it's all about the company, and that's great, but I've seen leaders forget to spend that extra time and do the interpretation. What does it mean to the individual employee?
John, several years ago, I had a landmark birthday, and a friend of mine gave me a joke T-shirt. At least I hope it was a joke. And on the front of the T-shirt, it read, "The thing about me is that everything's about me." Clearly not the way to go in communication. I still have that T-shirt, by the way.
So where?
I do not. Thank you, sir. I do not. Although some people might say that I should. No, absolutely. It's about others. It's about them. It's about our listeners. Let's go to number 5. Keep it short and simple. Audiences today have changed dramatically over the last 5 to 7 years. I think social media has had a lot to do with it. And audiences are overwhelmed with information. I'm sure that applies to you who are listening. When you have communication, bad, good, indifferent, you want to keep it short and simple. The longer it is, the more opportunity for misunderstanding. Now, on the flip side of that, it's more difficult to get short, clean, tight, integrated communications. It's more challenging. So that's something to keep in mind. Keep it short. I'm a big believer in the power of 3, which has represented the best communication since the beginning of time: context, action, and vision. So use the power of 3 if you possibly can to keep it tight and bright, as they used to say in the newspaper business, and keep it short.
Now, we know from the poll today that there are a lot of you that supervise larger teams. And I would think that you've probably had the advice, keep it short, keep it simple, maybe from an HR manager or an HR director, when you're probably having the toughest conversation that you can have, which is when you're terminating an employee. I respect all the HR guidelines of keep it short, keep it simple. Obviously, stay within the messages that have been laid out legally. But there's one other thing I want to add to that. Because, again, this is one of the toughest day-to-day things you'll ever do. And that is, I've always had the mindset going into a conversation like that, that person has to leave the building after you've had the conversation. And that person has to go home and probably has a spouse or a family member. And I never, ever want them to have to say to the person, you know, John, I don't really know why I was let go. So I agree with keep it short, keep it simple in these kind of interactions, and what I've tried to do in my career is just add on some simple explanations like, you know what, you did absolutely nothing wrong, but we have to restructure to cut costs. Another time I've had to say to somebody, you know, this meeting today is the result of discussions over several months about performance issues, and this is the decision that we've had to make. And another one, which was an especially tough one, which was to a more senior person, where I had to say, you know, I've done months of feedback and 360-degree feedback, and what I've learned is that I cannot find people who want to work on your team. So these are all very, very tough messages, but even delivering tough messages, you can keep it short and keep it simple.
Respect your audience. Wow, that's a big one, especially today. And I do a ton of presentation skills, and we talked earlier about how audiences have changed. So audiences have changed in many ways. They're much more impatient for the information to be about them sooner, and they're much more distracted. Okay? And it's so important for speakers, for writers, to put themselves in the place of their audience members. Making that leap, making that jump is the first step to effective communication. Okay? So obviously you want to communicate with honesty, clarity, and empathy. And when you're having a difficult conversation, let's face it, often the response is emotional. It's reactionary. And that's where we have to communicate like leaders and be calm, diplomatic, and factual. I can tell you from having worked in the media for many years and also doing a fair degree of media training that you also have a responsibility to correct any false or biased information early on in the communication. If you don't, it becomes part of the record. And I think we've all had experiences where we've gone out and tried to correct the record after the information has been disseminated. That's very difficult to do, especially in today's social media world. John?
You know, when it comes to respecting your audience, one of the things that we talk about here at the Canadian Management Centre when we're training people on how to become really effective leaders is that you have to understand that respect is not an entitlement of your position. It's something that you earn. And so you need to respect your audience, and in turn, they will respect you. One of the other things is in the new multi-generational workforce, I'd advise people to think more about informal messages, making it more personal and kind of less memo-driven inside the organization. And that when you think about some of the younger people joining the workforce these days, the Gen Y groups, they're people who love interaction. And so when you're having meetings on difficult issues, you need to do all the preparation we've talked about so far today, but you have to be open to open discussions and question and answer sessions, because that's how they think. That is how they communicate one to another. They interact.
Keeping cool, staying cool under pressure is the mark of an effective leader. It just is. And we see what happens when leaders lose their cool. Remember Tony Hayward, the former head of BP, during the Gulf of Mexico oil spill in 2010. What's his most memorable quote? "I want my life back. I want my life back." He was making it about him. He lost his focus. What's so important when we're communicating, especially in difficult times, is to stay in something I call your communications box. And your box is safe and it's secure. It's a very happy, warm place. It's like watching a late movie on a Saturday night, all cozy with your pizza, okay? Nothing bad's going to happen to you. And your box contains your story. It contains examples. It contains rehearsal and also transition phrases that always enable you to get back to your story. It's key to stay in that box.
Now, Jim, as I said earlier, teaches communication skills here at the Canadian Management Centre, and he and I were talking about the fact that communication is also a lot about how you appear in your physical demeanor to people. So we just wanted to remind you that especially under pressure, you have to remember that 70% of your message is delivered by your body language. So beware of what you're communicating through nonverbal cues. And I like to say to people, it's very straightforward. If your demeanor is confident, then the takeaway from your audience will be confident. If you're excited about what you're talking about, then that group will walk away excited. If you're nervous or uncertain, then that's exactly what they're going to take away. And it comes through in your body language and in your tone of voice. And the other thing to just be careful of is that sometimes when you're under pressure, you have a tendency maybe to rely on humor, sometimes just to break the ice in a tough situation. And I would recommend be very careful. If at all possible, don't use humor at all because it's so subjective. So stay away from it, but if for some reason you feel it's very necessary, be very, very careful about the example that you use.
John, I'm going to jump in there and say we have a saying in presentation skills that 3 things can happen when you tell a joke, and 2 of them are bad. Okay? Be very careful about that. Let's go to number 8, discuss the road ahead. Everyone in the world, especially today, wants to know what happens next. And if you don't tell them as far as you're able, they won't know. The last thing you want in communicating difficult or tough messages is an information vacuum, okay? And we know that 90% of your communication can be successful, but if the last 10% isn't, then that's not success. You've failed. A very smart friend of mine once said that you can spend 25 years with a company, but the people who work there will only remember your last 25 minutes. So lead with class. The road ahead is absolutely important. John's going to speak about listeners receiving updated information.
Yeah, I think it's important, as Jim has said, that, you know, you have to describe that future action. It's important when you create your messages to make that vision as vivid and compelling as possible. The people you're talking to, and again, whether it's your employees, whether it's your vendors that you work with, they want to know where you're going as an organization. So be as descriptive as you can, but be precise. The second thing is take 3 to 5 actions and articulate what those will be that the organization is going to do to get through the next period of time. That might be a 90-day plan or a 100-day plan, but make it really concrete for people. The third thing is be active. Invite employee involvement and participation to achieve the desired outcome that you're looking for. And last, and this is really important, especially now in the social media era, work with the assumption that whatever you say internally will be outside your building within 30 minutes. And I've had personal experience, I know that. People have taken emails that have been sent as a memo to inform staff, and that email has shown up outside the building within 30 minutes. Certainly on the social platforms today, people will go into their Facebook status and update information based on what happened in the workplace, and no question it could be as quickly as a minute or 2 minutes now as someone tweets out information that you've communicated. So as vivid as the description of the destination can be, and you want to make that to involve people, stick to what's factually going to happen, but remember, be prepared that that information will not stay inside your organization. In fact, it's more than likely to be outside your organization within about 30 minutes.
Number 9, leave it on a positive or as positive as you can get. Today, the world is awash in negativity. It circulates the globe like a low-grade fever. We're craving optimism, and we're craving leadership. Having said that, I can tell you, as a presentation skills coach, the power of negativity is really quite astonishing. If you make a negative comment in a presentation or even a negative reference, it will stick in the audience's mind. That's why it's so important in difficult or challenging communication to speak positively as much as possible. Now, if you have to take on a difficult issue, do so, but do it from a positive perspective as much as possible. And finally, know that reputations are made in bad times as well as good. I happen to be a Russell Crowe fan. My favorite movie, actually second favorite movie of all time, is Master and Commander. And if you'll recall, in 2005, Russell Crowe lost his cool and threw a telephone at a hotel clerk in New York. I think we'd all agree, not a cool thing to do. However, I was impressed by the way he handled that situation. He came clean, he apologized, he made it good as far as he could. He went on David Letterman shortly after, and this is what he had to say. This is possibly the most shameful situation I've ever gotten myself into in my life, and I've done some pretty dumb things in my life. So to actually make a new number 1 is spectacularly stupid. All right? What can you say after someone acknowledges and apologizes like that? Okay, John?
I think it's important to realize too, and again, Jim and I were talking earlier about the fact that all companies are brands, and that brands are basically what people think about you. And it recalled the fact that, you know, what you're doing today in your businesses to create good reputation and goodwill, those things will also get you through the bad times. And one of the examples that we were chatting about was the Toyota company and the fact that they had built a long-standing reputation on quality. And then you'll probably remember that in the last 18 to 24 months, they went through a horrific series of recalls across their Toyota brand and across their Lexus brand. And it would have really humbled most organizations and most organizations' brand reputation to have that happen. But they had done such a great job of engendering that quality mindset that they stepped up and said, you know what, we have failed. We are a company that focuses on quality. We have not done a good job. Their senior leaders on a global basis were visible. They took responsibility for it and made commentary around the action plans that were to follow. And that was a great example of how that brand has survived, and I would even argue has thrived on their total sales base going forward.
And finally, number 10, points to remember. I have a friend who is a senior executive who works in Montreal, a friend who's also a colleague, and I interviewed him for my next book, The Young Leader, which is coming out in the fall. And my friend, whose name is Sean Finn, said, a leader is someone who inspires people. Think about that. A leader is someone who inspires people. You can be a leader in your organization regardless of your position in that organization. Rudy Giuliani said, leaders need to be optimists. Their vision is beyond the present. Important to keep in mind. We organize our story simply, we tell it with sincerity, we know our audience, and we acknowledge its concerns. And finally, I'm going to quote my dear departed mother, Bertie, who used to say this to her husband and myself and my 3 brothers when things appear difficult or tough: better days ahead. And you didn't want to mess with Bertie. She was always right. And what that means is that there's a tendency when we're communicating difficult news to think it's never going to end. In fact, it's just a link in a chain. But know that our reputations can be made in bad times. As a matter of fact, it's easier to make your reputation in the bad times over the good. John?
And I just wanted to amplify one of the points that Jim made, which I think is obvious, but sometimes not obvious in the way that people execute communications. And that is that as the communicator, it's your job to inspire hope. But it's your job to inspire it because without you doing it, your audience will not inspire hope by themselves. You have to create it for them. And with that, they can buy into it and take that away. The other thing is, as Jim and I were chatting about how to help managers on the journey in these tough times, creating the simple story, absolutely, telling it with sincerity and honesty is critical. Just remember, though, that the people around you are always watching. They're watching for the language. They're watching your body language. Again, think about humor and whether to use it or not to use it. And they're also watching to see how you interact with your colleagues, especially during tough times. Does it look like you as a team of managers are united in what you're doing? Or does it look a little bit more like there's a bit of splintering going on? And if it's more the latter, that's a problem because it's undermining your communications. So I just wanted to summarize on the slide the top 10 points that Jim's covered today. Jim, do you want to call out any in particular?
You know, I think they're all important, John. The one that sticks out for me, again, as a former journalist who started out in this business in 1973, do the math, is keeping it short and simple, because I find so much communication today absolutely confusing. I often have to read media stories 3 and 4 times to understand them, and I don't think it's because I'm particularly slow, but you need to keep it simple, clean, and you need to make it about your audience. I'm going to add one point to the excellent points that John made. You become what you think about. If you want to be a leader, act like you're already a leader, okay? And keep the interests of your listeners and audiences always in mind.
Thanks, Jim. Now, we were taking a look on the Twitter feed, and one interesting question came in. Jim, do you have any advice on how to deliver tough messages to the multi-generational workforce that we have today?
It's a great question, and it's one that I'll be addressing in my book, The Young Leader. 3 points to keep in mind. Number one, okay, put yourself in the place of your audience. In other words, ask members of the Y and X generation how they prefer to receive their communication, because just doing it on your own ain't going to work, all right? So find out about your audience and its preferred method of communication. Okay? Keep it short, and 3, explore all the options for communication.
Great. Okay, just checking the feed. Here's another question for you. Do you have any suggestions for communicating a tough message to a hostile audience?
Whoa. Okay, that's a great question, and I'm going to ask for your opinion on this as well,
Sure.
John. Often, public officials will face hostile meetings when they're about to introduce some kind of development or change in the community or environmental issue that the community might not buy into. So I think it's really important to keep cool. We know from these types of interactions that anger can't sustain itself. It simply can't. The worst thing you can do in a difficult situation like that is to interrupt, is to bait people, is to combat them. You stay silent, you let the folks vent, and then when everyone's ready to listen, you can have a productive conversation. But until that time, it's not going to be productive.
I think that's great counsel, and from a message planning perspective, I think there's 2 things that we talked earlier about today that apply here in a difficult kind of hostile scenario. Number 1 is context. Even if they don't like what you're going to announce, providing appropriate context at least gets you halfway to understanding. And again, they may not like what your news is, but at least they'll understand the why. And the second thing, and this was, we mentioned earlier about really knowing your audience, and that's about empathy. If you make your message all about you, all about the organization, all about the impacts, and not truly address in an empathetic way how that person's life may be affected, then I think you've missed the mark. And I'd have to say in Ontario, there was a plant closing a couple weeks ago within the Caterpillar organization, and I just found it remarkable how a global company could be what I would say strident in the way that they messaged around a plant closing, and really did not acknowledge and seem to care about the impact that their decision was having on the local workforce in the local marketplace.
It's interesting that you would bring that up, because I was thinking the same thing, and I came to the conclusion that it just didn't care. It was going to sell its products without the goodwill emanating from London anyway. It was bizarre. In terms of what to keep in mind in a difficult conversation or interaction, a time limit is important as well, because if you don't establish limits, you're going to have chaos. That's key.
And then one other question came in, which we chuckled about because we're having a webinar, and the question was, do you have any advice on delivering messages to a virtual audience? So I hope we've been helpful today, but any thoughts, Jim?
Everything just gets simpler with a virtual audience. So in other words, there's not a lot of room for complexity. The audience, when you're having great communication, you want to take your audience through your story from A to Z. And that's especially important with a virtual audience, because it does not have often the benefit of the eye contact and seeing your physical movement and gesticulation. So everything gets simpler, everything gets cleaner, everything gets slower. I hope we accomplished that today, John.
I hope so too. Now, beyond just what we've been able to cover today, we wanted to direct you to some free resources that are available on the Canadian Management Centre website. The homepage screen is up in front of you, and as well, the web address, www.cmctraining.org. So please go there, take a look around. We've got articles, white papers, other webinars, and podcasts that you might be interested in, and of course, all of it is free of charge. If you're on Twitter, you still have a little bit more time left. You have until 2:30 this afternoon to tweet anything about today's webinar, and people who do tweet will be entered into a contest to win one of our prize packs. And with that, I just want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day. We really appreciate you taking 55 minutes out of your afternoon, and hope you got great value out of today's session. Thanks for myself and Jim Gray at the Canadian Management